Hey guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video right here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. Today we are hopping into Indigo Park Chapter 1, the first entry in the series, which gives us an intro to the game's characters, setting, lore, and of course, a whole bunch of unused content. We got everything from unused enemies, out-of-bounds secrets, and even a whole early version of the park that's still left over in the game that reveals some pretty big changes that were made for the final release. So let's get to it. Slap your critter cuffs on that like button below. It's time to hop into Indigo Park and find some lost bits. Alright, so for starters, there was once a model of Rambley the raccoon that was made for the game where he'd be seen, stretching his head out of a toilet, an obvious reference to a certain toilet of the Skibidi variety. Now it's obvious that this was just a joke by the developers as they teased this to be the main enemy of Indigo Park. But interestingly, apparently, there was a whole animation file for this object in the game too, and it wasn't removed until it was realized that the Skibidi Rambley animation was causing massive errors in the game for months. As such, it makes sense why this was removed, but honestly, it would have been a pretty funny haha if this had been left in as an out-of-bounds secret or something. Now next up, there are actually a few unused textures and models left over in the game. First, and frankly less interesting, there are some things that seem to be pre-made assets that the devs purchased, including things like some body models, shapes, etc. But then, starting on the more interesting side of things, next we have an unused model of a stray cat. Now I don't recall ever seeing this cat being used in the final game, and we'll dive deeper into this later this video, but there was actually some more functionality for this cat that was scrapped too. And similarly, next up we actually have two guns that are a remnant from an earlier point in development where the player was once planned to be able to wield a dart gun inside the park. The first of these pew-pew devices is apparently just a default Unreal Engine rifle, and then secondly, listed as New Gun, is a blaster that appears way more stylized for the setting that this game takes place in. Just like the cat, I'll definitely have more to say about this later on in this video when we check out some early ideas for this chapter. Next, moving on to the 2D arcade minigame found in Jetstream Junction, it turns out that there were once planned to be many more enemies encountered in the game instead of just the evil purple squirrels. Found in the game's files are references to bees, chickens, ducks, mushrooms, radishes, as well as slime. Now, although all of these folders contain some coding for their respective enemy, only a few of the folders still contain sprites for their enemies. And these include sprites for animations of the bees taking damage, an idle animation, as well as a sprite of a stinger bullet that I guess these bees would shoot out towards Rambley, the radish enemy getting hit, some sprites of the slime where we can see it would have been some green flubber slime, and I guess maybe the slime was repurposed for one of Evil Molly's attacks. And although the duck folder does have some sprites, they all just appear to be of Molly when she's brain rotted by Salem's potion. Molly is a macaw and definitely not a duck, so it's kinda weird that these are here. And although it's definitely cool that we get to see some sprites of a few of the unused enemies, unfortunately there's not really anything left that reveals what the chicken, duck, or mushroom enemies would look like. Then, also for the arcade game, we also have an unused sprite for a golden trophy listed simply as End, and it has both a simple idle sprite as well as a sprite sheet for an animation of it seemingly getting squeezed. Based on its name, it's extremely likely that this was going to be obtained by the player when completing the arcade game, but this idea was ultimately replaced by this. Now, one final rather interesting unused model is this fella known as Manny, and like the other models that I mentioned earlier, I believe Manny the mannequin here is another stock Unreal Engine asset, but this fella will come more into play later on in this video too. Next, I also stumbled upon this arcade cabinet model for a game called Burger Bungle. And this appears to be an arcade machine model from a pack on the Unreal Engine store, and fun fact, I believe this appears in the FNAF 3 stage in FNAF Help Wanted 1. But yeah, I'm assuming this might have been used as a reference for developing the arcade cabinet model that is seen in Jetstream Junction. Then, another pretty interesting thing I came across when looking through the files is this texture. Here we can see several things, including pictures of various people, including one of a guy that's still alive, apparently. There's a map of the United States with several states either circled, crossed out, or even more crossed out. And best of all, there are also several parts that are covered in text explicitly indicating that anything on here that isn't seen in the game was in fact just used as a placeholder and that it isn't canon to the series. So yeah, I don't think this was a map of which US states Rambley was looking to conquer. I just find it extra amusing that the developers added this text here as they just knew people would dive into this and probably overthink it. Hey there, Game Theory, how you doing? Now, before we move on, although not really unused, there are several folder names in the game's files that I thought were pretty funny. First up, a bunch of the assets used in the stores throughout the park are found in a folder titled Store Shit. The key model that's used for the keys that you find behind the stage in Lloyd's Theater is found in a folder titled Torture Devices. And then a blueprint file for Molly McCaw's voice lines during the game's chase sequence climax is titled Molly Yapsesh. And now, switching gears, for the second part of this video, let's zip the camera around and check out some things in the game that are normally unseen by the player. We'll first start with the maps that are used in the game and go through them in the order that the game normally progresses, and then we'll move on to the juicy unused maps after. So first, we of course start out at the entrance gates to the park, and before we check out the stuff out of bounds, we gotta check out these guns. I mentioned this in my recent speedrun video on this game, but this game's protagonist definitely goes to the gym. Take it easy on the dip machine, bro. Anyways, if you were hoping that there was anything interesting behind the several locked up doors that you can find throughout this area, I'm sorry to disappoint, but they don't really have anything behind them. Now, another interesting thing I saw is that just under the turnstile here that you normally need to scan your critter cuff to bypass is a duplicate of one of the parts of it just chilling here in the void. And then we also got a pair of the critter cuff scan points in both red and green below here. And also in the void is this lonely cardboard storage box that seems to have been misplaced and forgotten. Now, those are fine and all, but now let's get to the good stuff of this map. For starters, found just out of view where you first start the game is Manny the Mannequin. Yeah, for whatever reason, be it scaling or just a simple hidden secret, this fella is just asserting his dominance in an A pose here. I was kinda hoping that there would be some way that you'd be able to see even a bit of Manny here during regular gameplay, but just with how the objects are placed around, without getting out of bounds, it looks like he's completely hidden away from the player's view. I also decided to enter this area on foot, and Manny was surprisingly smaller than I thought it would be. Like, I think this model is just about the size of the garbage can beside it. And then lastly for this map, probably the biggest secret is that if we zip the camera way up high, we can see a secret message left by the developers on the ground in grass textures, greeting all of you that are watching this video right now. I'm sure the developers knew that players and YouTubers would try to break their game, so it's really cool to see this acknowledged in a fun little secret like this. Oh yeah, also while we're far out of bounds here, we can see that both the Rambley Ferris wheel as well as the large clock tower are like half complete, as their models are missing various components. But seeing as how far away they are from where the player normally is in the map, this isn't very surprising. Next up, we have the tunnel entrance to Rambley's Railroad, and there's not much here besides this streetlight found way off in the distance, as well as this untextured basic model found under the map that at best I can describe as a very early train model or something. Yeah, I don't know. I was really hoping for a Skibidi Rambley somewhere out of bounds in one of these inaccessible bathroom backrooms, but alas, this map is Skibidi free. I guess one more interesting thing in this room to mention are these knocked over poster frames. With the other posters still up being of the other rides that you can find in this chapter, you'd think that maybe these would be some other rides that weren't shown yet. But if we look at these from under the floor, we can see that they are both just some artwork of a city skyline with some very big clouds. This is obviously only the first chapter, so I do think that the idea is that these are probably meant to be for 2 other rides, as well as maybe 2 other park mascots that we may see in the second chapter. Then moving on to the actual Rambley's Railway ride, we can find various normally unseen objects out of bounds, like blocks, an early version of the Rambley's Railway entrance door, and even parts of a building. We'll get into this more later, but these objects all seem to be remnants from an early build where the entire game took place on one map rather than having to load between different ones at a time. We also got some more cardboard boxes chilling out of bounds here, and then probably the most interesting object found out of bounds in this map is actually the Unreal Engine rifle object that I went over earlier in this video. Now you're probably wondering just why is a blaster like this found in this map? Well, you'll just have to add it to the ever-growing list of things that I'll get back to later on in this video. Anyways, after this we have the Mainstreet area of the park. First here, I checked out the inside of the building to the right as you first enter this area, and unlike basically every other building in this section that you can't enter where there's a whole bunch of nothing inside, here, well, there's also a whole lot of nothing, but there are also some stairs in here that you can't normally ever see. I even tried playing inside this building, and although you can go up the stairs, you can't jump off of them to reach a higher floor, so I doubt that this building was ever actually intended to be entered. And although there's not much else of note here besides checking out the inside of some of the other buildings and getting another closer look at the clock tower, an interesting thing I noticed is that the Ferris wheel animation is actually kinda broken. Now I never noticed this during my playthroughs, but it turns out that part of the Ferris wheel animation has the wheel stopping and then like rotating around the y-axis, and with the lighting disabled like this, it looks kinda goofy. Then, unfortunately for the Jetstream Junction entrance area, aside from a handful of misplaced objects under the floor, that's about it, so onwards we go to the landing pad. Here we can zip around to see Molly Macaw running in place, or awkwardly just waiting for us with her strawberry jam dropping down her face. It was also pretty interesting to view the vent crawl segment from above to really see just how simple it is. And then below the map, there's actually a long blue pipe with another Molly running in place. And then near that is a long hallway with the player's arms as well as Molly seemingly ready to attack. Now immediately, my first theory when I saw this was that this is where the death animation plays, and then after testing, yeah, that's exactly what this is. I didn't notice this when I played the game, maybe because it's so much darker normally, but when you do get caught in this chase sequence, if we slow things down, we can see that the player does actually in fact get warped to this room. And it's extra obvious if you warp from a section of the map that isn't just a hallway of colored squares. Then at the end of the chase segment, under the floor, we can actually find Molly in the animation of her losing her head. And this actually plays on repeat down here, so if you really like that animation, well, do I have some good news for you. Oh, and this one is PG as well, without all the blood and gore that's in the normal animation. Well, I guess as PG as decapitation can be. Also near here, where the doors close to non-royal wranglers, we can see a large mechanical arm out of bounds. Now this appears to be the same arm that's used in the Critter Corner store when Rambley gives you the Critter Cuff, so I'm thinking it may have either been meant for a similar use with the TV nearby that's on the wall, or maybe a way to show how these doors close. Oh, and if you were curious what's at the end of this hallway that we're not given access to in the game, well, it's a whole lot of nothing, at least for now. I'm fairly confident that this will end up getting more meaning in future chapters once the protagonist gains that epic Royal Wrangler status. Oh, I guess I skipped over it earlier, but for Lloyd's main stage, in addition to being able to get a nice and close look at Lloyd sleeping without him running away, under the map we can also find Lloyd just behind the player's arms, and yeah, you probably guessed it, much like the Molly room earlier, this too appears to be for the animation used when Lloyd tries to grab you when you're leaving this area after getting the key. And I don't know what it is, but something about this just looks so funny to me. And then above this, we can also see a looping animation of the player scanning in the critter cuff, and then below both of these is yet another critter cuff scanner thingy. So yeah, it's like a triple stack of out-of-bounds goodies. And before we get to the last area of the game, we of course have to chat about the arcade game, which, surprise surprise, we can zip the camera around in too. Now, for starters, we can see the entire area from a distance, which I thought was pretty cool, and then just under where you start the game are a few hidden secrets as well. First, there's a little box room containing 2 instances of evil Molly Macaw in 2 of her phases, which you encounter in the battle against her jumping as well as running around, leaving the slime bits. And then, just above this room is actually the unused golden trophy that we went over earlier. Not sure why it's left over here at all, but it's really weird seeing this just under where you start the game. And then lastly, for the arcade game, under the final Molly Macaw battle area, we can find a pair of very tall hidden trees, as well as yet another instance of evil Molly in yet another one of the battle phases just hanging out here. And now, lastly, for the normally used maps, the Road to Oceanic Odyssey doesn't have much to mention here except for 2 things. One, we can get a nice view of Finley here for as long as we want, which is nice since this model is normally only teased for like a few seconds in the game. And then secondly, and frankly more interestingly, is that we can actually see that there's a large portion of the Mainstreet area still loaded in this map. And if we head over there, in addition to seeing like 10% of it left over, we can also see the model for the Rambley action figure on the ground here, which is a completely different spot than inside the bathroom in which it's normally seen. And on that note, after gassing up the unused maps throughout this video, now's a good time to explain why this is probably still here. So, left over in the game is a map titled Beginning, and once loaded into this map, it's quickly made obvious that, like I mentioned briefly earlier, the plan was originally for the entire park to be loaded in at the same time in one map, rather than having the player load between smaller chunks of the map one at a time. And this is why we can see parts of the tunnel area in Rambley's Railroad, as well as the Mainstreet in the Road to Oceanic Odyssey, as these are leftovers from that original plan. Now, why are these sections still there and not just deleted? That's a question for the developers, but in any case, I think it's kinda cool that we can still see them out of bounds. Oh, and this map isn't just the entire game in one map either, but it turns out that it's actually remnants of an earlier point in development where quite a few changes can be seen, both visually as well as gameplay-wise. I'll probably have like a full playthrough of this on my second channel, TetraBit+, but I'll go over the highlights of the changes here. So for starters, although the gate to the park is open right off the bat, the idea to turn on the power is still here, as there's still a generator to power on in the same area on the right. And going here, we can see the first major difference in that originally, the door to the Wrangler's only room would have been slightly open, and the player was actually going to lift up the door using this otherwise unused animation. And I don't know, personally, I think this would have been a better way to get in, instead of the door just magically opening by itself when you get to it as is seen in the final game. Anyways, once inside, we can see that this was originally just one big room, instead of it being split into 2 with the generator room initially closed off in the final version. In this early map, the intro bit from Rambley still plays so we can hear his monologue, but nothing appears on the TV here yet. And similarly, you can sit at the desk, but once again, nothing appears on the monitors. Next, the spot you normally find the gear that you need to repair the generator is completely different, and there's also no hole in the ceiling, and as such, instead of ending up on this box, the gear is also found in a different spot just behind the desk chair here. And after getting this gear, we can still repair the generator to get the power running, but the door was already open, so yeah. Also, through the window just to the left of the desk in this room, we can actually see a little friend. Yeah, the otherwise normally unused stray cat model can actually be seen here. And it doesn't stop there. Although you normally can't enter that room, by hacking my way inside, I was able to actually discover that you can interact with this cat too. And by doing so, the protagonist will give the stray cat some well-deserved pets in yet another normally unused animation. It's honestly kinda crazy to me that this cat was ultimately scrapped, especially considering it even has fully functional animations for it left over as well. Then other things of note in the starting area are that the collectibles are completely missing, and this basically goes for most of the other ones normally seen in the game. And if you were wondering if Manny is still here in this map, yep, right there in the same spot. Then moving on to the next section, the critter corner is quite different, both internally and externally, as it's missing its sign, and we have a large window with an equally large Rambley plush sitting there. Then inside the store is also different, looking a bit less decrepit, and it's missing all of these stanchion things leading up to the counter on the left. Now Rambley's prompt to start talking about the critter cuff in the store seems to trigger normally, but the cuff never does get sent down. Thankfully though, we can still reach the hitbox of the cuff, so I was still able to grab it from the ceiling, and that's good because we still need it to get through this next turnstile. Next, we can move on to the entrance area to Rambley's Railroad, where at first, aside from not needing to cross through loading zones, it remains pretty similar, aside from us being able to not only see through the rubble here, but also even walk through it to get to the Mainstreet area to skip the Rambley's Railroad section entirely, which I don't think was intentional. Then we can see the old entrance to Rambley's Railroad that we saw left over underneath the final version of this map. And going through it, we can make our way through a very basic early version of the lineup area to the ride. And then, once we get to the front of the line, yup, we can actually find the Unreal Engine gun here too. And if that wasn't cool enough already, here you can actually walk over it to pick it up, and this will actually get you the other unused gun that we went over earlier. Oh yeah, it's fully functional too, letting you shoot out Nerf-style darts wherever you please. And you might already have an idea where this is going, but if not, yeah, it turns out that before Rambley's Railroad was just a semi-interactive cutscene, it was actually going to be a full-on target shooting gallery ride with targets appearing all over the place in each of the different rooms that the train stops at, and even in that one room in between. And although most of the ride is similar otherwise, there are some more minor differences, like Finley, although still existing in the cave, not being animated to come out of it. And then there's also a major difference in that the train originally didn't break down midway through the ride in this room. In fact, the pathway to the generator and the generator room itself didn't even exist at this point, and this was just another target practice area. Honestly, I think having this ride as a target shooting gallery was a great idea, and it just makes so much sense and explains some stuff, like that the reason the curtains randomly open and close in the Lloyd section is that they would have originally been obstacles blocking the targets. So I think it's kind of a shame that this was changed. Now, I was really curious to see if there was a reason as to why this change was made, so I reached out to the game's creator, Unique Geese. But unfortunately, he seemed a bit reluctant to really answer my question, but he did tell me that he'll probably make a video talking about this at some point, and that this area went through a lot of changes. So stay tuned for that video if he ever does get around to making it. And then, I guess it was from a later point as it's missing all of the targets, but there was also an early build of the chapter that was shared with David Barron, in which we can see an early placeholder version of Finley that would pop out of the cave. In any case, back to the early map here, the ride ends off with us getting out at the same area that it ends in the final version, and this is where this early map kinda breaks as we keep the blaster, and that's pretty much where Rambley's lines end in this map. I'm curious what you guys think about this change. Do you think the ride should have remained as a target shooter, or do you like how it turned out in the final version? Anyways, from here we can of course move on to the Mainstreet, and just like in the final version, Jetstream Junction is closed, so we have to go to Lloyd's main stage to grab the key. Well, not really actually, because this locked door isn't exactly fulfilling its purpose. But let's go back to Lloyd's main stage anyway. And on the way there, another difference in the main street can be seen with the restaurant here, in which we can see it being in much better shape, as well as it having 3 entrances instead of just 2, with this one in the front that's not there in the final version. And oh, would you look at that, the Rambley action figure is in the middle of the street, exactly how we saw Out of Bounds in the final Oceanic Odyssey map, go figure. And this is actually the only collectible that I could find in this entire map, so I guess this might have been the first one that was developed. There's also the kiosk machine here, and Rambley still talks through it, but this version is pretty broken, as interacting with it will basically just soft lock the game. Now into Lloyd's main stage. Initially we can see that Lloyd doesn't just run away when you approach him on the stage, but he does kinda just vanish instead. There's no interactable piano on the stage at this point, the backroom maze of shelves and boxes is mostly similar, just lacking a few things like the Lloyd statue and some boxes. The first Lloyd jump scare wasn't implemented here yet, and instead the box will kinda just drop down. The office room where you grab the key has a completely different layout inside, and instead of the keys being pinned to a board, they're just found upright on this desk on the right instead. And then finally for this area, much like with the first Lloyd jump scare, despite still having the Lloyd and arm models under the stage, this jump scare is broken too, as attempting to scan the critter cuff here will also just soft lock the game. Next up, we got Jetstream Junction, and major differences here include a large lack of the giant Molly statue in the entrance. Overall, there are much fewer objects like the plants and seats and such. Signage for the rooms is either missing or is an early version, as we can see with the landing pad sign here. The invisible walls aren't quite finished, as we can jump into some areas that we can't in the final version up here. And then probably the biggest difference of all is that not only is the arcade machine completely absent in this version of this area, but the entire room is different too, as here it's some sort of maintenance room instead of the final version's small restaurant area. So yeah, I guess at this point in development, it's unclear if the arcade machine was even planned to be added in at all, at least in this area. Now moving on to the landing pad section, we got quite a few more changes, including the purple star decal being smaller and not on the adjacent wall, as is seen in the final version. And then there's also the green triangle, which here is in a completely different spot on this weird wall. You can actually interact with this little disc here, and it causes the player to seemingly, look through something. Unfortunately for me though, this also seemed to soft lock the game. Since this wall looks so different than the rest in this room, my theory is that there were once these little viewing holes in the play area that the player would have to peep through to find some of the shapes. Thankfully though, much like the start of this map, the door that the shape puzzle here activates is already open, so we don't really need to worry about solving it anyway. Oh yeah, there's also this little cube here that you can pick up, carry, and drop wherever you want. Now, I'm not sure if this is just some sort of default Unreal Engine interactable, but this block doesn't really seem to serve any sort of purpose here besides making a cool noise when interacted with. Oh, and we can also see Molly awkwardly just kinda floating outside of the play area here too. You can also interact with this disc and it will cause some sort of Molly animation before she disappears, and then the game soft locks once more. This is very similar to the other animation I mentioned earlier, so maybe one of the peepholes was planned to have resulted in a Molly jump scare or something. And then, once we get through these doors and go down this orange slide, we can see that instead of loading into a new area with the steps that go up to the button to open the doors to the chase sequence as is seen in the final version, taking this slide would have instead directly led you to the start of the chase segment into this hallway that's very similar to the one in the final game. Unfortunately, there is no chase sequence added in here yet, and that's for the simple fact that after taking the next slide, yeah, this is basically where the room ends. We can still clip through the left door here to go through another slide, but our progress is quickly stopped as we basically get to where the developers reached at this certain point in developing this game. And although that's all we have for the chase sequence, we do actually still have the hallway that you go through after becoming a rookie wrangler. And just like in the final version, we can once again see the robotic arm out of bounds as well. Now that's mostly it for the state of the game at the point that this version of the map was worked on. Although there's no proper Oceanic Odyssey area yet here, we do still have this large translucent block that I think may have been an early version of Finley's aquarium. Why do I think this? Well, for the simple fact that his model can be found swimming in the void just below it. And if you actually walk up to this area, Finley will start to swim through the block from 2 different directions, which I thought was pretty cool to see. Oh, and I guess a few more things for this early map are A, there's this really weird object modeled here, and honestly, I have absolutely zero clue what this could be. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them in the comments. And then B, way off in the distance, after going through some mountains that load in and out way too quickly, there are some grass textures that appear to be remnants of another secret message. Although the "Hi YouTube" message isn't seen in this version of the map, I can't make out what any of these are, but this patch here looks suspiciously close to an @ symbol, so maybe at some point it was a Twitter handle or an email or something. Unfortunately, at this point, it's impossible to tell. And that's about it for this glimpse into an early development stage of Indigo Park. I was honestly shocked to see so many changes and bits of scrapped content like the animations, the cat, and of course the whole shooting gallery aspect of Rambley's Railroad. And that's only the first unused map of 3 left over in the game. Next is a level titled MoonTown, and it looks nothing like the style of the rest of the game, and that's probably because it's found in a folder titled Example Content. So this appears to be a pre-made level, and based on it looking somewhat similar, this might have been used as a reference for developing the Mainstreet area of the park. In any case, there's not all too much to this map aside from some dark streets and a few cars here and there, nothing too crazy. And then lastly, to plop the cherry on top of this unused map cake, we actually have an early version of the arcade game, simply titled 2D. And immediately when loading in, we can see some differences. We spawn in with both Molly and Salem flanking us in their idle animations for some reason. We can see an otherwise unused animation of Molly flying her plane in the background. The heads-up display is different. We can see that originally the Rambleberries weren't used as health, as here we have a dedicated 3-heart health meter. And Rambley actually controls different here, as he doesn't have a double jump, but will instead just jump much higher. Honestly, the controls in this version are pretty rough, especially with how the camera follows Rambley around. We can also see this white box in the top left, and although this is pure unsubstantiated speculation, I think that maybe this would have been for a player icon, and perhaps with all 3 characters appearing at the start, originally there was a plan for the player to choose who they wanted to play as. In any case, although definitely unfinished with some level differences here and there, this version is still like 70% playable, as you can progress through the game as some invisible forces will still launch Rambley to later sections. Eventually though, we get to the end, where here it's just a long white platform where once we get to the end of it, we can see Molly's crashed plane. But there's no boss battle or anything, so it kinda just ends here. Well, not for us, as we still have some out-of-bounds exploring to do. There isn't as much out of bounds as we saw in the final version of this arcade game, but just to the left of the starting area, behind this large boulder, we can find Molly's plane flying animation just idling here. And then the most interesting thing of all, even further to the left of this, we can find what looks like a hangar from Jetstream Junction, and inside, we can see Rambley and Molly hanging out near her plane. Now my immediate theory for this find is that this might have been the original opening to the arcade game, where the characters would be seen here chatting before Molly takes to the skies, or alternatively maybe an ending screen for when Rambley would save Molly after she crashes. Though the plane looks in pretty good shape here, so it's probably the first one. Regardless, it was really cool to find this here, and this definitely reinforces the idea that the original plan for this arcade game was something quite a bit different than what ended up being developed for the final version. Yeah, I was definitely pretty pumped when I first saw this out here. And my friends, that's about it for Indigo Park Chapter 1, at least for now. I honestly had a blast exploring this first chapter, so I'm super excited to see where this game goes from here. This is definitely up there in both being one of my favorite videos I've ever worked on, as well as one of the longest Lost Bits videos I've ever made, if not the longest. So shoutouts to you if you made it all the way to the end here. If you enjoyed this video, let me know and I'll definitely revisit this game when Chapter 2 rolls around. Till then though, check out some of my other Lost Bits videos, and be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell to find your way back here in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for rambling by today, and I will see you in a bit.